The screaming started before the transport even touched down. I pressed my four-fingered hands against the observation deck's reinforced titanium glass, watching our carefully selected team of xenobiologists stumble out of the landing craft like drunken juveniles. 3 of them were already retching into their emergency air filters. Commander Vorthak, our supposed expert in hostile environment operations, had collapsed entirely and was being dragged to safety by 2 medics. "Magnificent," I muttered, my translator crackling with static interference from the planet's electromagnetic storms. Absolutely magnificent. Behind me, Admiral Kethvar's tentacles writhed in what I'd learned to recognize as barely contained fury. "Tactical Officer Zendai, remind me again why the Galactic Academy insisted on this particular training exercise." I turned from the window, careful to keep my expression neutral despite the absurdity unfolding below. "Standard protocol, Admiral. All xenobiology specialists must complete field training on a Class 7 hostile world before graduation. The Academy Board was quite specific about maintaining standards." "Standards," the Admiral repeated, each syllable dripping with disgust. "Look at them, Zendai. Look at our finest scientific minds, reduced to quivering larvae by a few atmospheric toxins and some elevated radiation readings. To be fair to our pathetic excuse for a research team, Kepler 442c wasn't exactly a vacation resort. The planet's surface temperature fluctuated between mildly uncomfortable and instantly lethal, depending on which of its 3 suns happened to be facing your location. The atmosphere contained enough corrosive elements to dissolve most standard protective equipment within hours, and the local wildlife had evolved specifically to hunt anything stupid enough to leave the safety of orbital platforms. In short, it was exactly the kind of world that the Academy had classified as absolutely forbidden for student assignments roughly 50 years ago, after an unfortunate incident involving a research team and something the survivors could only describe as tentacled nightmare fuel with acid spit. "Sir," I said carefully, "perhaps we should consider relocating the exercise to a more manageable environment. The moons of Deltara 7 have similar atmospheric compositions, but significantly reduced." "Absolutely not." Admiral Kethvar's primary voice box resonated with finality while his secondary one added a series of untranslatable curse words that would have made a Regelian pirate blush. "The Academy Board wants proof that our training programs produce competent field researchers, not pampered laboratory technicians. We stay until the exercise is complete." That's when she walked in. I didn't notice her at first. My attention was focused on the tactical display showing our research team's vital signs, most of which were flashing various alarming shades of red. But something made me turn, some shift in the room's atmosphere that my prey species instincts had evolved to detect over millions of years. She stood in the doorway like she owned the place, hands tucked casually into the pockets of what appeared to be were those recreational foot coverings. On a military vessel? Her hair was tied back in a simple arrangement that somehow managed to look both professional and completely unconcerned with military regulations. She wore the standard-issue xenobiology student uniform, but it fit her like she'd tailored it herself rather than grabbed it from the standard dispenser. "Excuse me," she said, and I immediately noticed her lack of translator static. Native Galactic Standard, but with an accent I couldn't place. "I couldn't help but overhear that you're having some difficulty with the surface mission." Admiral Kethvar's tentacles stopped writhing entirely, never a good sign. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of quiet menace that had earned him his reputation during the Andromedan conflicts. "Student, what is your designation?" "Kira Thorne, sir. Xenobiology specialist, 3rd-year academy student." She stepped further into the command center, apparently oblivious to the fact that Admiral Kethvar could have had her expelled for insubordination with a single word. "I noticed your team is having some adaptation issues with the hostile environment protocols." I glanced at the tactical display again. Adaptation issues was certainly one way to describe the fact that half our research team was currently unconscious and the other half was begging to be evacuated. "Indeed," the Admiral said slowly. "And you believe you have some insight into managing Class 7 hostile world operations, Student Thorne?" Something in her expression shifted just slightly, but enough that my threat assessment instincts started sending up warning flags. "Well, sir, I've had some experience with hostile environments. If you need someone to complete the surface mission, I'd be happy to volunteer." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the distant hum of the ship's fusion reactors. Admiral Kethvar's tentacles had gone completely still, which in my experience meant he was either about to promote someone or have them ejected from the nearest airlock. "Student Thorne," he said finally, "are you familiar with the Academy's regulations regarding Deathworld assignments?" "Yes, sir. Absolutely forbidden for students, punishable by immediate expulsion and permanent ban from all Galactic Academy institutions." She paused, tilting her head slightly. "But those regulations specifically apply to students who require specialized equipment or environmental modifications to survive. The protocols make exceptions for students whose homeworlds already qualify as hostile environments." I felt my throat sacs contract involuntarily. "Student Thorne, what exactly is your world of origin?" That's when she smiled, and I realized with growing horror what she was about to tell us. "Earth, sir. Sol 3. I believe you might know it by its galactic classification." The blood in my veins turned to ice water. I'd heard stories about Earth, whispered conversations in academy corridors, cautionary tales shared by instructors who'd survived first contact protocols. Earth wasn't just classified as a hostile world. Earth was classified as a Category 2 death world, the kind of planet where evolution had apparently decided that everything should be capable of killing everything else in the most creative ways possible. Admiral Kethvar's primary voice box produced a sound I'd never heard before, something between a choke and a laugh. "You're from Earth?" "Born and raised in a place called Colorado, sir, though I spent a few years in what used to be called Australia before joining the Academy." She said it like she was discussing the weather, completely oblivious to the fact that she'd just casually mentioned surviving on a planet where, according to the xenobiology textbooks, even the plants had evolved to be predators. "Australia," I repeated weakly. "The continent where the Academy lost an entire research expedition?" "Oh, that." She waved a hand dismissively. "They landed during spider season. Rookie mistake. Spider season." She'd said, "spider season," like it was a minor inconvenience rather than a biological nightmare that had resulted in the permanent quarantine of an entire continent. The tactical display chose that moment to emit a series of urgent chimes. Our research team's life signs were degrading rapidly, and the automated medical systems were recommending immediate evacuation to prevent permanent neurological damage from the planet's atmospheric toxins. "Admiral," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "we need to extract the team immediately. The atmospheric composition is exceeding all safety parameters." "Or," Student Thorne said, stepping forward, "you could let me finish what they started." Admiral Kethvar turned his full attention to her, all four of his eyes focusing with the intensity of a targeting system. "Student Thorne, you are proposing to complete, alone and without backup, a mission that has just incapacitated a team of 12 experienced xenobiology specialists." "Yes, sir. On a planet classified as unsuitable for any form of organic life except in emergency circumstances." "Yes, sir. Without environmental suits, atmospheric processors, or any of the standard protective equipment that our team is currently wearing." She glanced down at her casual clothing. The recreational foot coverings I now realized were called flip-flops, some kind of thin fabric covering her torso, and pants that looked like they were designed for comfort rather than survival. "Well, I'd probably want to grab a water bottle from the commissary. It looks pretty dry down there." A water bottle. She wanted to tackle a Class 7 Deathworld armed with a water bottle. I pulled up her academy records on my personal display, hoping to find some indication of advanced military training, specialized environmental adaptation courses, or at least a history of enhanced genetic modifications. What I found instead made my situation infinitely worse. "Admiral," I said quietly, "according to her files, Student Thorne has no special training in hostile environment operations. No genetic modifications, no cybernetic enhancements, no previous military service. Her academic record shows standard xenobiology coursework with concentrations in adaptive evolution and predator-prey dynamics." "Of course it does," Admiral Kethvar muttered. "And her physical assessment ratings?" I scrolled through the data, my confusion growing with each entry. "Sir, this has to be an error. According to these readings, her bone density is approximately 3 times galactic standard. Her cardiovascular efficiency ratings are..." "Admiral, These numbers suggest she could function normally in atmospheric conditions that would kill most species instantly. That's not an error, Student Thorne said cheerfully. Earth's gravity is about twice what most worlds consider normal, and our atmospheric pressure runs pretty high. Plus, the oxygen concentration, I actually have to use breathing regulators on most Academy worlds to avoid oxygen toxicity. Oxygen toxicity. She had to regulate her breathing to avoid poisoning herself with too much of the gas that most of us needed in carefully controlled doses to survive. Student Thorne, Admiral Kethvar said slowly, what is Earth's current planetary classification? Oh, the Academy upgraded us last year. We're officially a Category 12 Deathworld now, though honestly, I think that's a bit harsh. I mean, yes, we have some challenging fauna, and the weather patterns can be unpredictable, and most of the plant life produces toxins, and the ocean is full of things with way too many teeth, but it's not like we're actively trying to kill visitors. She paused, considering. Well, except for the drop bears, but those are mostly just in Australia. I was beginning to understand why the Academy had made Deathworld assignments forbidden. It wasn't to protect the students, it was to protect everyone else from discovering that some species had evolved on worlds so hostile that they considered Class 7 planets to be a bit dry. The tactical display chimed again, more urgently this time. Our research team was now officially in critical condition, and the automated systems were preparing for emergency evacuation whether we authorized it or not. Student Thorne, Admiral Kethvar said, if I were to authorize this mission, what exactly would you need from us? Just transport to the surface and the mission objectives. Oh, and if you have any sunscreen, that would be great. 3 suns means I'll probably burn if I'm not careful. Sunscreen. She was worried about sunburn on a planet where the radiation levels were high enough to sterilize most organic matter. And your mission timeline? She glanced at the tactical display, studying the research parameters our now unconscious team had been attempting to complete. Looks like standard biological sampling and environmental analysis. Give me 3 hours, 4 if the local wildlife is feeling particularly social. 3 hours to complete a mission that we'd allocated 2 weeks for a full team of specialists. Admiral Kethvar was quiet for a long moment, his tentacles moving in the complex patterns that indicated deep thought. Finally he spoke. Student Thorne, I am going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Are you absolutely certain you can complete this mission safely? Sir, I appreciate the concern, but I spent my childhood hiking through ecosystems where everything was either poisonous, venomous, or actively hunting me for sport. I learned to swim in waters where the local predators consider sharks to be appetizers. This planet looks challenging, but it's not exactly what I'd call dangerous. Not dangerous. A Class 7 Deathworld was not dangerous to someone from Earth. Very well, Admiral Kethvar said. Authorization granted. Tactical Officer Zendai, prepare a transport and monitor Student Thorne's mission status. If anything goes wrong, it won't, she said confidently, though you might want to have medical teams standing by for when I bring up the research samples. Some of the local microorganisms look pretty interesting, and you'll probably want to study them in containment before they adapt to shipboard conditions. She headed toward the exit, then paused and turned back. Oh, and Admiral, you might want to update the Academy's hostile environment protocols. If you're having this much trouble with Class 7 worlds, you're really not prepared for the kind of places where humans go for vacation. And with that terrifying thought, she disappeared down the corridor, leaving Admiral Kethvar and me staring at each other in stunned silence. I pulled up the transport schedules, trying to calculate how long it would take to retrieve her remains after the planet killed her in whatever horrific fashion it had been evolving for millions of years. That's when Admiral Kethvar's personal communicator chimed with an incoming priority message. He activated the display, and both of us froze as we read the sender identification. Galactic Academy Board, Emergency Classification Update. The message was brief. Effective immediately, all references to Sol, 3 Earth as a Category 12 Deathworld are to be revised. Recent taxonomic analysis indicates previous classification was insufficient. Sol 3 is hereby reclassified as Category XV Apex Deathworld, with permanent quarantine status recommended for all non-native species. Academic study is to be restricted to remote observation only. I felt my legs give out entirely, and I sank into the nearest chair. Admiral, I said weakly, What exactly is a Category XV classification? Admiral Kethvar's tentacles had gone completely limp. According to Academy records, Tactical Officer Zendai, a Category XV world is one where the evolution has produced species so lethally adapted that they represent an active threat to galactic biosafety. Planets where life doesn't just survive hostile conditions, it thrives in them and actively seeks out greater challenges. We both turned to look at the tactical display, where Student Thorne's life signs showed her calmly making her way toward the transport bay. "Sir," I said, "should we abort the mission?" Admiral Kethvar was quiet for a moment, watching the display. Then his secondary voice box produced what might have been laughter. "Tactical Officer Zendai, I have a terrible suspicion that we're about to discover something far worse than our complete failure to understand hostile world protocols." "What's that, sir?" "I think we're about to learn that humans don't consider Deathworlds dangerous because they've never actually encountered anything they couldn't handle." The transport bay doors sealed with a soft hiss, and Student Thorne's signal began its descent toward the planet's surface. That's when the real nightmare began. The first sign that something was wrong came exactly 17 minutes after Student Thorne's transport touched down. I was monitoring her vital signs from the command deck, expecting to see the gradual degradation patterns we'd observed with our previous team: elevated heart rate, respiratory distress, the telltale neurological spikes that indicated atmospheric toxin exposure. Instead, her readings were so stable they looked like she was taking a pleasant stroll through a climate-controlled botanical garden. "Admiral," I said, checking the sensor array for malfunctions, "either our monitoring equipment is completely compromised, or Student Thorne is somehow functioning normally in atmospheric conditions that should have killed her 3 minutes ago." Admiral Kethvar moved closer to the display, his tentacles coiling with nervous energy. "Show me the environmental readings from her location." I pulled up the atmospheric analysis data and immediately wished I hadn't. "Sir, the radiation levels at her current position are approximately 8 times the lethal threshold for most galactic species. The atmospheric toxin concentration is high enough to corrode our equipment sensors, and the ambient temperature is fluctuating between 47 and 63 degrees Celsius. And Student Thorne?" I checked her bio readings again, certain I must be misreading the data. Heart rate steady at what appears to be her resting baseline. Oxygen saturation normal. Core body temperature. "Admiral, according to these readings, her core temperature is actually dropping slightly. Like her internal systems are compensating for the external heat by running cooler." That's when we heard her voice over the comm system, clear and completely untroubled by any kind of environmental distress. "Command, this is Thorne. I've reached the primary research site. Beginning biological sample collection now. Fair warning, the local ecosystem is a bit more active than your previous team probably expected." "More active?" I pulled up the surface surveillance feeds, trying to get a visual on her location. What I saw made my throat sacs contract so violently I nearly passed out. Student Thorne was standing in the middle of what could only be described as a feeding frenzy. The planet's indigenous fauna creatures that looked like someone had taken a spider, crossed it with a shark, and then given it acid spit and anger management issues were swarming around her in numbers that should have resulted in her immediate dismemberment. Instead, she was calmly collecting samples with a standard Academy field kit, occasionally pausing to observe one of the creatures with what appeared to be professional interest. "Student Thorne," Admiral Kethvar said into his communicator, his voice carefully controlled, "please describe your current tactical situation." "Oh, the locals?" Her voice came through with what I was beginning to recognize as characteristic, human understatement. "They're just curious. I think they've never seen anything like me before. A few of them tried to take a bite when I first arrived, but they seemed to lose interest pretty quickly." I zoomed in the surveillance feed and nearly dropped my datapad. Several of the creatures were lying motionless near her position, and I could see what looked like bite marks on their carapaces. "Student Thorne," I said carefully, "did you defend yourself against the indigenous wildlife?" "Defend myself?" She sounded genuinely confused. "Oh, you mean when they tried to taste me?" "Not really. I just bit them back. Seemed like the polite thing to do." She had bitten them back. Student Thorne had engaged in combat with creatures that our xenobiology teams had classified as extremely lethal to all known forms of life, and had won by using her teeth. "Admiral," I whispered. I'm reading elevated toxin levels in the local predators near her position. It's like something poisoned them. Admiral Kethvar's tentacles went completely still. Student Thorne, are you aware that you may be toxic to the local ecosystem? There was a pause, and I could hear what sounded like equipment being moved around. Huh, that's interesting. I mean, humans do produce a lot of compounds that are poisonous to other species, but I figured that was mostly just Earth biology. Hang on, let me check something. The surveillance feed showed her approaching one of the smaller creatures, which immediately fled when she got within a few meters. She followed it with what appeared to be scientific curiosity, and I watched in horrified fascination as every other predator in the area actively retreated from her presence. Yeah, okay, that explains a lot. Her voice crackled through the comm. Command, you might want to make a note in your xenobiology files. Human biochemistry appears to be incompatible with local fauna. They're all acting like I'm some kind of apex predator. Student Thorne, Admiral Kethvar said slowly, what exactly does incompatible mean in this context? Well, from their behavior patterns, I'd say they recognize me as something higher up the food chain than they are. A lot higher up. It's actually pretty similar to how Earth predators react to humans, except usually we have to make noise or move aggressively to get this kind of response. I checked the biological analysis sensors, hoping to understand what was happening. The data made my situation considerably worse. Admiral, I said quietly, the atmospheric sensors are detecting chemical compounds we've never seen before. Complex organic molecules that appear to be, sir, I think they're pheromones. Pheromones? Predator pheromones. Student Thorne isn't just immune to this planet's hostile environment, she's broadcasting chemical signals that identify her as something so dangerous that everything else should run away immediately. The implications of this were staggering. We weren't dealing with a human who happened to be resilient enough to survive on a death world. We were dealing with a species that had evolved on a planet so lethally competitive that they'd developed natural defense mechanisms that worked on completely unrelated alien ecosystems. Command, I'm getting some really interesting readings from the geological samples. Student Thorne's voice interrupted my existential crisis. The mineral composition here is pretty similar to some formations back home, but with much higher concentrations of heavy metals. Perfect for what you need, actually. She was collecting samples. While functioning as an inadvertent apex predator, she was calmly conducting scientific research. Student Thorne, I said, how are you managing the radiation exposure? The levels should be lethal, even with full environmental protection. Oh, that. I could hear her moving around, presumably continuing her sample collection. Humans evolved under pretty intense solar radiation, especially at higher altitudes like where I grew up. Plus, we had a lot of background radiation from natural sources. This isn't really much worse than a day at the beach back home. A day at the beach. The radiation levels that had incapacitated our entire research team were equivalent to recreational activities on Earth. Student Thorne, Admiral Kethvar said, I need you to be completely honest with me. Exactly how dangerous is your home world? There was another pause, longer this time. Sir, I'm not sure that's a question I can answer objectively. I mean, Earth seems pretty normal to me. But if you're asking about comparative lethality, I could hear her sigh over the comm. Admiral, when I was 7 years old, my elementary school had to cancel outdoor activities because we had a grizzly bear wandering around the playground. The teachers didn't evacuate us or call for emergency assistance, they just moved recess indoors until the bear got bored and left. Elementary school. She'd been exposed to predators that could kill most galactic species when she was a juvenile, and the adults had treated it as a minor scheduling inconvenience. When I was 12, I went camping with my family in an area where the local predators included mountain lions, wolves, bears, venomous snakes, and spiders whose bite could cause tissue necrosis. We cooked our food over an open fire and slept in fabric shelters. Fabric shelters. They deliberately made themselves vulnerable to attack by multiple apex predators and considered it a recreational activity. And when I was 16, I spent a summer working on a research station in Australia, where I had to check my shoes every morning for spiders that could kill me, avoid swimming in waters where the local wildlife included sharks, jellyfish, and crocodiles, and make sure not to touch any of the local plant life because most of it was poisonous. I looked at Admiral Kethvar, whose tentacles had gone completely limp. We were both beginning to understand that the Academy's classification system was fundamentally inadequate for describing Earth. Student Thorne, the Admiral said carefully, what you're describing suggests that your entire species has evolved survival capabilities that exceed anything in our xenobiological databases. I guess so, sir. Though to be fair, most humans don't think of it that way. We just call it being careful in nature. Being careful in nature. What she described as basic safety precautions would be considered extreme survival training for elite military units in most galactic civilizations. Command, I'm wrapping up the sample collection now. I found some really fascinating microorganisms in the thermal vents. They seem to have evolved some kind of collective behavior that might be proto-sentience. You'll definitely want to study these in full containment protocols. Proto-sentience? I said. Student Thorne, are you saying the microorganisms are showing signs of intelligence? Maybe. Hard to tell without proper analysis equipment. But they're definitely communicating with each other and adapting their behavior based on environmental changes. Plus, they tried to communicate with me. They tried to communicate with her. The planet's microorganisms had recognized her as something worth attempting contact with. How exactly did they try to communicate? Chemical signals, mostly, and some kind of electromagnetic pulse pattern. I responded with basic mathematical sequences, and they seemed to understand. We had a pretty good conversation, actually, though I'm not sure how much they understood about galactic biology. She'd had a conversation. Student Thorne had conducted first contact protocols with a previously unknown form of life, while collecting scientific samples in an environment that should have killed her instantly. Student Thorne, Admiral Kethvar said, please return to the transport immediately. We need to conduct a full mission debriefing. Copy that, Command. Transport ETA 15 minutes. Oh, and Admiral, you might want to update your planetary classification databases. This world definitely has sentient life, and they're a lot more advanced than your initial surveys indicated. The comm channel closed, leaving Admiral Kethvar and me staring at each other in stunned silence. Admiral, I said finally, what exactly have we learned here? Admiral Kethvar's tentacles moved in slow, thoughtful patterns. We've learned, Tactical Officer Zendai, that the Academy's understanding of Deathworld classifications is fundamentally flawed. We've been measuring hostile environments by their ability to kill us, not by their ability to produce life forms that thrive under those conditions. I nodded slowly, still trying to process what we'd witnessed. And, Student Thorne? Student Thorne represents something that shouldn't exist according to our understanding of evolutionary biology. A species that evolved under conditions so extreme that they've become accidentally compatible with environments that we consider uninhabitable. The transport bay indicators chimed, signaling Student Thorne's return. Through the observation windows, I could see her stepping out of the shuttle, carrying several sealed sample containers, and looking like she'd spent the afternoon in a library rather than conducting solo operations on a planet that had just defeated an entire research team. Admiral, I said, what do we tell the Academy Board? Admiral Kethvar was quiet for a long moment, watching Student Thorne make her way toward the command deck. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. We tell them the truth, Tactical Officer. We tell them that we've discovered a species that doesn't just survive on Deathworlds, they make Deathworlds safer by existing on them. And we recommend that all future hostile environment operations include human personnel, not because they need the training, but because everyone else needs their protection. Student Thorne appeared in the doorway, still wearing her flip-flops and carrying what appeared to be a bottle of water she'd never needed to open. Mission complete, sir, she said cheerfully. Sample collection successful, first contact protocols initiated with local sentient microorganisms, and I managed to map several new mineral deposits that should be extremely valuable for industrial applications. She paused, looking at our expressions. Also, I think you should probably reclassify this planet as a garden world. It's actually quite pleasant once you get used to it. Perfect for establishing a permanent research station. Perfect for a research station. She thought a Category XV Apex Deathworld would make a nice place to build a laboratory. Admiral Kethvar's tentacles coiled and uncoiled slowly. Student Thorne, one final question. In your opinion, what would it take to make this planet genuinely dangerous? She considered this seriously, tilting her head in a way that I was beginning to recognize as characteristically human. Honestly, sir, you'd probably need to introduce some kind of artificial threat, maybe a few active volcanoes, or some kind of weather system that changes rapidly. As it stands, it's mostly just hot and a little bit poisonous. Nothing you couldn't handle with basic safety equipment and common sense. Basic safety equipment and common sense. That was her prescription for surviving on a world that had just been classified as unsuitable for any known form of life. Oh, she added, and if you do establish a research station here, you'll want to include humans in the permanent staff. The local ecosystem seems to respond well to our presence, and we can handle any wildlife management issues that come up. Wildlife management. She was volunteering her entire species for what amounted to serving as apex predators in charge of maintaining ecological balance on alien worlds. As Student Thorne headed off to file her mission reports, Admiral Kethvar and I stood in the command center trying to comprehend what we'd just witnessed. Tactical Officer Zen Dai, the Admiral said finally, I believe we need to contact the Academy Board immediately. Yes, sir. What should we tell them? Admiral Kethvar's tentacles moved in patterns that suggested both resignation and something that might have been relief. We tell them that the galaxy's most dangerous death world has just volunteered to help us survive everywhere else. And as I began composing the report that would fundamentally change how the Galactic Academy approached hostile environment operations, I couldn't help but think that the universe had just become a much safer place, assuming, of course, that the humans remained friendly.